Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's my first time at the dispatch box as the new Secretary of State for Transport, and I welcome the opportunity to update the House on HS2. I don't think there's any future in obscuring the cost, benefits or timetable of HS2, so I've announced on the 21st of August an independent cross-party review led by Douglas Oakervie into whether and how HS2 should or shouldn't proceed. The review will consider its affordability, its deliverability, benefits, scope, phasing, including its relationship with Northern Powerhouse Rail. The chair will be supported by a deputy chair, Lord Berkeley, and a panel of experts from business, academia and transport to ensure it's independent, thorough and objective in its assessment programme. Some of these individuals on the panels have been very passionate advocates, others have been extremely vocal critics of this project, but these panellists will provide input to and be consulted on the report's conclusions. This review is actually underway and it will report to me on time this autumn. I'll discuss its findings with the Prime Minister and the Chancellor, and its recommendations will help inform our decisions on the next step or otherwise for this project. On our first day back on the 3rd of September, colleagues will be aware that I placed in the House, or if they're not, it's there, advice that I received over the summer from the recently appointed chairman of HS2 Limited, Alan Cook, on the cost and deliverability of the current scheme. The chairman of HS2 has said that he does not believe the current scheme can be delivered within the budget of £55.7 billion set in 2015 prices. Instead, he estimates that the current scheme requires a total budget, including contingency, in the range of £72 to £78 billion, again set in 2015 prices. And regarding schedule, the chairman does not believe the current schedule of 2026 will be delivered for its initial services of Phase 1. He doesn't think that's realistic. In line with lessons from other large major transport infrastructure projects, his advice proposes a range of start dates rather than a specific one. He recommends 2028 to 2031 for Phase 1, with the staged opening starting with initial services between London Old Oak Common, Birmingham Curzon Street, followed by services to and from London Euston later. He expects Phase 2B, the full high-speed line to Manchester and Leeds, to be open between 2035 and 2040. The chairman is also of the view that the benefits of the current scheme are also substantially undervalued. All these matters will now be considered by Douglas Oakervie within the scope of the Oakervie review itself. I said when I announced the independent review into HS2 that I now want Doug Oakervie and his panel to assess independently these findings and other available existing evidence. That review will provide recommendations on whether and how we proceed. Stepping back, Mr. Speaker, I'd like to make one further wider point. We all in this House know we must invest in modern infrastructure to ensure the future prosperity of our nation. However, it is right that we subject every single project to the most rigorous scrutiny possible, and if we are to truly maximise every opportunity, this must always be done with an open mind and a clean sheet of paper.
Mr. David Lidington.
Mr. Speaker, can I first of all congratulate my right honourable friend, the Secretary of State, on his new responsibilities and welcome the review that the government has set up. I have three questions for my right honourable friend. First, in view of this week's revelation that HS2 is overrunning both its budget and its schedule, something which many of us have been predicting for a long time but which has been systematically denied for years by HS2 Limited and by his department, what assurance can my right honourable friend give to the House about the transparency of both the review that has been commissioned and the government's formal response to that? Second, my right honourable friend will know that enabling works for HS2 are still being carried out along Phase 1 of the route. Ancient woodlands are being felled, productive farmland is being occupied and used by HS2 Limited. Public money is being spent on these works while the review, as my right honourable friend says, may lead to a recommendation to cancel or significantly change the project altogether. So will the Secretary of State now accept that those works are prejudicial to the outcome of the review that he has established and order that they cease? Third, I have a queue of constituents whose land has been taken by HS2 Limited for preparatory works, but who have still to receive the payments that were formally agreed with HS2 Limited. Now, the Government is rightly committed to crack down on late payment. Would my right honourable friend not agree that HS2 Limited should be setting an example in this regard, acting as a laggard? And since he, as Secretary of State, is the sole shareholder in HS2 Limited, will he now take responsibility for insisting that HS2 Limited puts this injustice right immediately?
Hey!
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Well, look, first of all, on budget and schedule, exactly as I said in my opening statement, I'd say to my right honourable friend, I completely agree. There is just no future in trying to obscure costs or being unclear about it. It is the case that in a massive infrastructure project, Europe's biggest, in a developing project, costs just aren't known, they're speculated about, you then start to firm them up as you literally dig into the ground in this case. So I can see how, over a period of time, things move. But nonetheless, I simply take the view, as soon as I've got the information, I will inform the House. As soon as I got that Cook report and the House returned, I stuck it straight into the library. I can assure my right honourable friend I will continue to do exactly that going forward. Secondly, I think it might be helpful to colleagues to know that I've asked for Douglas Oakerby to meet with members of Parliament. He has set up in committee room on Monday 2A on Monday the 9th between 3:30 and 5 an opportunity for any colleagues to go and see him, and you can make your own arrangements with him separately, but I'll inform the House of that. On the enabling works, look, we're in a position where I'll have to make a go, no-go decision about this in December. And I know that this won't delight my right honourable friend, but it seemed to me that even to be in that position, if we didn't continue to make preparatory works, then I wouldn't be in a go, no-go decision. I'm sorry to disappoint him, but that is the current position, and then we can take a decision. On CPO payments, I share his concern and anxiety. When people are having their lives, their livelihoods, their homes potentially ripped apart by a project, supposedly for the wider good, it is right that the state compensates them promptly and efficiently. I would be most grateful to see more details of those cases. I've already had one across my desk which I've sorted out, and I'd like to see others. There's no excuse for a CPO where people aren't paid for it.
Andy MacDonald.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I too congratulate the Secretary of State on his appointment and welcome him to his place. And he comes into post at a time of crisis for the country, but an absolutely critical moment for HS2. I would just gently remind him that we did ask for regular reports, and we recommended a peer review when Phase 2A was before this House some weeks ago, and I'm sorry that he wasn't able to vote for that, or indeed for the Prime Minister to express a view at all. He's also mentioned that this is a cross-party review underway. I just gently point out that there's been no consultation with me whatsoever, and if it's to be genuinely cross-party, perhaps he might want to take up that invitation. But we've been consistently told by his predecessors and his then ministerial team that the 2015 figure of £55.7 billion for the entire project was the full cost of HS2 and that there was no reason to change it. Mr. Speaker, it's hard to conclude anything other that it has been plain and obvious for some considerable time that this was not accurate. So I asked the Transport Secretary, when was his predecessor told that the figure of £55.7 billion was not accurate or sustainable, and when was he first told that the timetable for delivery could not be adhered to? Mr. Speaker, isn't this yet more evidence that this government has totally failed to exercise any control over this project, not just in terms of cost, but in terms of redundancy payments and key appointments, which transpired to be unsustainable? Not only that, Mr. Speaker, when the contracts for Phase 1 were being granted, despite hedge fund managers making a packet out of the inevitable demise of Carillion, this Tory government crashed on regardless, awarding the doomed organisation a valuable HS2 contract. Mr Speaker, that the government has been totally incompetent and reckless is beyond doubt. But worse than that, there hangs over this government the unpleasant smell that Parliament may have been misled, however unwittingly, given that it is stark staringly obvious that when the Minister responsible for HS2 stood at that dispatch box a matter of weeks ago to tell the House that there was only one figure for HS2 and one figure alone, that assertion was completely and totally inaccurate. If there is going to be delay, can the Secretary of State give some assurance to the 9,000 people who are currently employed by HS2? What assurances can be given to them? Mr Speaker, this government continues to be characterised by lack of transparency, and I welcome the remarks of the Secretary of State to put that right, but that still remains, and that lack of candour. And Mr Speaker, once we can be assured that there is no prospect of them reneging on the legislation to avoid a no-deal Brexit, we on this side of the House relish the prospect of a general election to turf them out.
Secretary of State.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. Look, on regular reports, I will come back to this House as many times as the House is prepared to hear about it and continue to update in every possible way possible. I thought it might be helpful if I also were to make the introduction, if the Honourable Gentleman hasn't already, had it to Doug Oakervey and perhaps organise for him to meet separately with him. There are, of course, cross-party members on the review, and the review is genuinely kind of full of sceptics. I think people were surprised when we launched a review which had such a broad view on this project. Look, in terms of prices, I mean, he's absolutely right, the prices have changed over time. I seem to recall that this was originally a project by the previous Labour government. It was going to cost about £13 billion for the whole thing when it was first conceived. One of the issues that we have, and I think it's a wider issue than HS2, is that these things start off being fixed in a price of a particular period of time. This £55.7 billion was about 2015 prices, and it doesn't actually allow for inflation. And so you end up quoting prices which are just out of date, and every project on that basis will always be said to have overrun on costs, because probably actually the benefits also improve as well. So I think we have to find better ways of doing all of this. I can reassure the honourable gentleman, the first that I received advice on this was Alan Cook's final report on the 1st of August, and that's the report that I published. And finally, I can undertake that we will make sure that we return to this House with every piece of update that we have, and I encourage him to be involved in the Oakervey review.
Colleagues will be aware that there is some pressure on time today because there are several further pieces of business to follow, but equally understandably there is intense interest in this monumental mess, and I know that the Secretary of State is very keen, to his credit, to answer questions on the matter, so I shall do my best as always to accommodate the understandable interest of colleagues. Dame Cheryl Gillan.
Mr Speaker, I was just about to say there are still people affected, members affected by this project that don't have a voice. I was going to include yourself. Clearly that is not the case. And of course the Right Honourable Member for South Northamptonshire, who has always joined me in the fight against HS2. And in welcoming the Secretary of State to his position, can I also welcome my Right Honourable friend from my neighbouring friend in Aylesbury? It's so good to hear his voice raised in this chamber against this dreadful project. I endorse everything that the member for Aylesbury has said, and it applies to my constituency as well. Can I say to the Secretary of State that he also needs to look at the National Rail Travel Survey, on which one of the raison d'etres for this project is based. It has not been updated since 2010. In answers to me, the Department doesn't appear to know how much it would cost to update it. But that, coupled with the fact that we are not allowed still to see the passenger forecasting documentation, means that transparency is far from being the watchword of HS2. Can I just say to him that, having looked at the Chairman's stocktake, to find pages, Mr Speaker, that have absolutely redacted right the way through means that transparency is not the order of the day. Can I just say that this opportunity to review entirely this project should be grasped with both hands by the Secretary of State, and he should actually review the nationwide transport and communication policy. And I urge him to take a deep breath and look at a comprehensive assessment across car, bus, train, air, and indeed the new technologies such as 5G and broadband, because I think it's essential that we look at the technological advances before we let this project go any further. Can I just say, Mr. Speaker, that as the carriages being built for Crossrail pile up in Worksop because we can't get that project right, let us just draw a deep breath, cancel this project, start again, and get a decent, comprehensive transport policy.
Secretary of State.
I know that Douglas Oakerby will have been listening to my right honourable friend's words with great interest and will no doubt take into account the latest National Rail Travel Survey information. She will, of course, meet with him as well. And I'll just reflect on the final point, because the rest of it is, of course, Douglas Oakerby is looking at all this. The final point about all forms of travel and across the country. I entirely agree with my right honourable friend. I recently, having ordered it 2 years ago, got an electric car, and it arrived finally a couple of weeks ago. It is clear that transport is changing in this country. It is absolutely clear that we have to take a more holistic view of transport at all, of which rail is one part, and there's much else to consider.
Alan Brown.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I too would like to welcome the Secretary of State to his new position, and he must be so thankful to have inherited another failing Grayling legacy. Mr. Speaker, we know the increased costs and delays have been covered up since 2016 and denied at the dispatch box, so while I welcome the review, should there not be an inquiry into this hiding of key information from the House? And while I welcome the review, it's a bit strange that we've got a document that sets out the terms of the review and around a third of this document is redacted. So can the Secretary explain why that is? What changes are going to be made to the cost-benefit criteria going forward and why? And while the Secretary said many of the benefits of the scheme were previously underestimated, I would remind him a lot the business case rested in the fact there's assumptions that any business people travelling the train were treated as downtime, so shorter journeys was treated as extra productive time. But clearly that's not the same now. We've got Wi-Fi and a go, so we confirm that the business case won't be over-egged in that aspect. Now, the current proposals also mean that journeys north of Crewe to Scotland will actually be slower than the existing Virgin service just now. So will the review look at that and look at perhaps a different type of rolling stock? But if it does, what does that mean for the existing rolling stock procurement, which is ongoing at the moment? What further reviews are going to be made to track design that could mean slower high-speed trains but reduced costs in terms of that cost-benefit analysis? And what is the contractual status of the recent contract awards to First Trenitalia, given that the government might now be doing a full-stop decision? What would that mean for that contract? What's the spend to date, the committed spend going forward, and the Barnett allocations to Scotland? And what's going to happen going forward? We were promised at the dispatch box in day one of the high-speed trains operating they would go all the way to Scotland, and that's now not the case. So can the Secretary answer these, and if not, put them in writing, please?
I think I hope the honourable gentleman will forgive me if I write back to him on some of that rather than detain the House on all of it. But he is absolutely right, and I should have mentioned in response to my right honourable friend, I'm unhappy about having any of that Alan Cook report redacted. I've read the rest of it. It's not hugely exciting. I pushed back on that with the department, and it is just the lawyers saying this stuff is the commercially confidential stuff that I can't force to be released. But I totally agree with him. It'd be much better if you could read every single page. I mean, that is the law. On the downtime, but I don't disagree. It's just that, you know, lawyers will not allow that to happen. On the downtime when travelling, he's absolutely right. Lots of people work very productively when travelling. I know that's my favourite time to work uninterrupted. The benefits, I think, and that is something I can assure the honourable gentleman that Doug Oakerby will look at, the benefits to which Alan Cook was referring to were some of the build benefits where a line runs and you might therefore have new industry and so on and so forth around it, homes, etc. And the last point I'll comment on, and I'll write back to him on the rest, is implications on the West Coast Partnership, very important indeed. In their contract, I think in 20 26, but it would be in line with if HS2 went ahead, they would become a shadow operator. So it's built into that particular contract if the thing goes ahead.
Order. There is a further urgent question after this, and there are then 3 ministerial statements before we get to backbench business. Therefore, there is a premium upon brevity from back and front benches alike. For the avoidance of doubt, what I'm looking for from colleagues is not dilation and not preamble, but single-sentence questions, which will be brilliantly exemplified, I feel sure, by the Right Honourable Gentleman Member for Derbyshire Dale, Sir Patrick McLaughlin.
Thank you for that challenge, Mr. Speaker. Can I first welcome my right honourable friend to his position? Can I say to my right honourable friend that the easiest thing for the government to do is to cancel this project? That would be easy to do. I actually think it would be the wrong thing to do for this reason. I will find it ironical that as we leave the European Union, I can get a high-speed train to Paris or to Brussels, but not to Birmingham, Manchester, Leeds, Sheffield. And when my honourable friend talks about the overspend, we seem to be able to accommodate the overspend at the drop of a hat for Crossrail, which is overrunning and is a London project as is incredibly important for London, and not take a similar view to a project which has been long thought out and, I believe, absolutely essential for the major cities outside London in this country.
Well, I would say to my right honourable friend, I'm not short of advice on what to do on HS2, but few pieces of advice come from somebody as distinguished as a former Transport Secretary. I've heard what he's had to say. I know Doug Oakerby will have done, and I look forward to taking it into account.
Lillian Greenwood.
I welcome the Secretary of State to his place. He must understand the huge disappointment in the East Midlands that HS2 Phase 2B, which will transform connectivity, as the Honourable Gentleman has just said, Right Honourable Gentleman, apologies, between Birmingham and the economies of the Midlands, Yorkshire, the North East and Scotland. It's now facing a delay of up to 7 years or even cancellation. And that's particularly the case when the Chancellor yesterday failed to even mention the Midlands Rail Hub in his spending review, and when his predecessor not only repeatedly assured us that HS2 would happen, but also cancelled the electrification of the Midland Main Line. I know that the Oakerby review is due to report, but that disappointment will turn to deep anger if he doesn't ensure that the Midlands receives the investment in its transport that it needs.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to have the question from the Transport Select Committee Chair. The one thing I can assure her is there's £48 billion of other unrelated rail investment over the next few years. So both the Midlands and the Northern Powerhouse Rail side of things will certainly have huge and massive investment.
Reiterating my plea for brevity, I hopefully call Sir William Cash.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. First of all, welcome to your the Secretary of State to his new position. Second thing is, I entirely endorse the views of the member for Aylesbury and the member for Amersham. The reality is that this whole project is completely out of control. The costs have gone up, as I've said repeatedly. I voted against it. There is a petition in the House of Lords, which I believe my constituents are absolutely right to pursue. This whole project is a complete white elephant and should be cancelled.
As I say, I'm not short of advice on this, and Doug Oakerby will definitely have heard his words.
Mr. Barry Shearman.
I try to be brief. I've always been against this. I've been reviled by ministers when I've said it's going to end up at 100 billion. I wanted the investment in a network across the north of England in preference to this. But will you assure me we'll learn the lessons? This is a great sector. We do wonderful things. We built the Olympics on time, and it was a magnificent. We learn the lessons. I understand there are 12 gagging orders from senior former employees of HS2. Will they air their evidence? Can they give evidence to this inquiry? And can we make sure that we learn the lessons? This sector, we're good at it. Why has this gone wrong?
Well, I mean, even with the Olympics, the cost changed over a period of time. This is actually the truth, of course. But the honourable gentleman will know that big projects do require management, and this process is designed to make sure this is properly grasped. I agree with him. We need to deliver that transport infrastructure across the north. I'm surprised no honourable member has mentioned it yet, but these two questions are not entirely unrelated to each other, so we must get it right for the north, for all of our country.
Jeremy Wright.
Speaker, I'm not sure it's the entirely appropriate expression to congratulate my right honourable friend for inheriting responsibility for HS2, but may I wholeheartedly congratulate him for becoming the Secretary of State. In agreeing entirely with what our right honourable friend for Aylesbury has put to him this morning, can I press the Secretary of State on the point he made about enabling works? As he knows, there is more than one kind of enabling work currently underway. Some of the enabling work is the destruction of ancient woodland sites. There are 7 of them in my constituency, along with a very old and much valued pear tree in the village of Cubbington. Surely it is possible and surely it is sensible, given that he's announced an all-options review, including the possibility that this project will be cancelled or significantly revised. Surely it's possible and sensible to categorise those types of enabling work that will do irreversible damage and postpone them until the review has concluded. He's already announced a substantial delay in this project. Surely a delay of a few weeks more would be sensible to make sure we don't do irreversible damage.
Mr. Speaker, as I said before, to have a proper go, no-go decision, we do need to continue to allow enabling works. However, I can actually ask my right honourable friend and the Transport Minister, who is handling these major projects, to meet and discuss this specific concern.
Dennis Skinner.
Unlike Derbyshire Dales, the HS2 goes through many villages in the Bolsover and North East Derbyshire area. The result is that there are a lot of people in those villages, more than 100 people affected by the HS2. I want to know as soon as possible just exactly what is going to happen to this £100 billion project, because it goes through Derbyshire on 2 separate lines. Not only does it go past Sheffield, it also stops at the Sheffield station. And so there is a slow track and a fast track in Derbyshire. The idea that the HS2 is based upon getting to London 30 minutes sooner is a joke. And for that reason, he should start over again.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Look, I know that the honourable gentleman's constituency is affected in a big way, and I refer to what I said before. This project affects a lot of people's lives, the demolitions and the rest of it in his patch. He asked me to do this as soon as possible. I have got Douglas Oakerby on an unbelievable timetable, supported by a fantastic group of people, to get this done and reported back this autumn. He will not have to wait before the end of the year.
Maggie Through.
Speaker, Long Eaton, Sandy Acre and Stanton Gate are grossly affected by the eastern arm of HS2. And as the Chair of the Treasury Select Committee has already indicated, it brings its advantage as well. It brings jobs and growth as well as the pain. 2 things. One is that any delay causes further stress and uncertainty, not just for residents, but for businesses as well. And they will be blighted evermore, even if my honourable friend takes the easy way out and cancels the Eastern Arm. And my plea to the Secretary of State is do not cancel that Eastern Arm. I will not allow the East Midlands and Erewash to be the poor relations yet again.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I think every exchange indicates the extent to which, whilst everyone is able to welcome a review, I suspect when we get to the announcement of that review on the other side, that the House won't be quite so united. But I absolutely hear my honourable friend's comments.
Liam Byrne.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Inflation aside, this multi-billion-pound increase in costs betrays nothing other than sheer incompetence in the management of this project. But in the West Midlands, 100,000 jobs are now in jeopardy. Hundreds of millions of pounds of new rates are now in jeopardy. The future prospects of the younger generation are now in jeopardy. So I want to know from the Secretary of State what compensation has been sought by the Mayor of the West Midlands, because my understanding is he's asked for precisely nothing.
Well, we have on the Doug Oakervee board a range of different people, including Andy Street. We are making sure that all the representations therefore go into it. And as I say, I don't want to kind of rush to prejudge this. We do know certain things. We know from the Alan Cook report this range of 72 to 78 billion. I don't have confidence in the data that I've been provided yet to know whether the benefits have outstripped or understripped these various different costs. And I just start with a blank sheet of paper, and I just want the data. Give me the facts, and then we'll be in a much better position to decide, including for people throughout the West Midlands.
Victoria Prentice.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I'm sure I was as pleased as you were, Mr. Speaker, to hear about the review undertaken by the new Secretary of State. Can he reassure me that as part of the new cost-benefit analysis, the review will take into account that many people work very hard while on trains, as I am about to do as I return to my constituency on a high-speed train run by Chiltern Rail?
Well, absolutely. I think travelling on a train can be a fantastic way to chomp through constituency work or anything else that people are doing on business or on pleasure. And I think it is one of the most civilised ways to work when we have our trains running on time, which is another related priority.
Yeah, I've got
Yvette Cooper.
I've got something.
Will the government widen this review, not just into its complete lack of grip on the HS2 project, but into the continued failure of the department to remember that there are towns as well as cities in this country continually locking billions of pounds into ever-delayed, ever-escalating projects for cities, whilst towns like ours in Castleford and Pontefract have inadequate trains, overcrowded, the old Pacer trains, no disabled access to our trains, and once again we're just expected to accept a trickle-down benefits many decades into the future. It's not good enough. When will we actually get a fair deal for our towns?
Well, as the representative of two towns, one which calls itself a city but it's actually a town in Welwyn Garden, I absolutely agree with the idea that towns have a very significant part to play in the economic and social life of our country. One good piece of news, those Pacers are finally going by the end of this year.
Dr. Julian Lewis.
What level of exorbitant expenditure will the government finally decide to pull the plug?
So it's not just a question of the expenditure, as I mentioned before, it's also what the benefits are. So can I ask my honourable friend to just be patient enough so that the data is gathered on both sides of that and we can come to a rational and sensible decision.
Colleagues should now follow the right honourable gentleman for New Forest East with single-sentence questions. If they don't, let's be absolutely clear, they're stopping other colleagues taking part. It's as simple as that. Vera Hobhouse.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Will the Minister commit to look at any new major transport infrastructure projects in line with the 2050 net zero carbon target that this House has set itself?
Yes. Martin Vickers.
You, Mr. Speaker. There is a north-south divide when it comes to transport spending. Can the Secretary of State give an assurance that he will consider the benefits to the northern economy when he reaches his decision?
Absolutely.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I ask what the status of this review is if we go to the polls this autumn? My constituents see it as a pre-election bribe for their voters in the Shires.
Well, look, I think this project's too serious to be thinking in those terms, and I certainly wasn't thinking in those terms when I asked Douglas Oakervee to do the review. As I've said twice now, this is about people's lives, their livelihoods, and the ability of the economy of the country to function. So we should, and I hope we do, regardless of what happens when we finally get that election call, I hope there will be a cross-party consensus to continue this important work on a cross-party basis and get this job done.
Will the Secretary of State look at the cost envelope by taking into account enhancements that benefit those on the route, inflation and incompetence?
Well, as the terms of reference, which I encourage honourable and right honourable members to read, makes clear, this is wide-ranging and does take all of the matters into account.
Clive Betts.
Given the delays to the southern section of the route, will the Secretary of State now ask the review to look at the possibility of starting the northern sections before the southern sections finish, so there's a degree of working overlap?
That is, in fact, one of the things that Douglas Oakervie is looking at. And interestingly, in Alan Cook's report, which is in the library, he suggests doing 2A and 1 together.
Craig Whittaker.
Mr. Speaker, I agree with my honourable friend that spiralling costs need to be challenged and indeed held to account. However, this is vital for the northern routes which are already overstretched. Can my right honourable friend assure me that this actually isn't just a smokescreen to cancel this project, which many of our current executive don't like?
My honourable friend's question reminds me of after I did a clip on the day of announcing this, that we're going to have a full, thorough and open review, that when the camera was switched off, they said, but what do you really think? What I really think is let's have a full, open and thorough review.
Failed. One sentence.
Business leaders in Sheffield are deeply concerned about this review. Does the Secretary of State recognise, in whatever else he's considering, cancellation would damage the northern economy?
Well, I can assure the honourable gentleman, whatever happens, the northern economy and northern powerhouse rail is set to steam ahead.
Jeremy Lefroy.
Will the review take into account the potentially negative effects of the business case on the existing and absolutely vital West Coast Main Line?
Yes, it will, but can I... Well, I mean, I would ask my honourable friend to actually meet with Douglas Oakervie to make those points, because, yes, every element of this is being taken into account.
John Cryer.
Mr. Speaker, isn't it the case that there are many abandoned former railway lines across the country for which there is now extensive demand, for the first time for a very long time, which could be reopened for a fraction of the cost of HS2?
With huge respect to him, I curse beaching every day in this job. Yes, I agree with him entirely.
Ozzy.
Delay or the effect of delay or cancellation on the West Coast Main Line, which is of concern to my constituents in Rugby.
I don't think there's any direct ramification, and we've just re-let the West Coast Partnership contract, so none, I think, is the answer.
Mr. Speaker, HS2 is vital for the economy of Manchester and the North because, as the Chairman Stocktake says, it's not a standalone railway, it's an integral part of ambitious regional growth plans that are already attracting investment. So can the Secretary of State assure us that those wider benefits will be taken fully into account in this review?
I can, and I've met with the Manchester Mayor and mayors across the north, and will absolutely be taking that into account. I'm due to meet with them again shortly.
I voted against HS2 every time. Wouldn't the money be better spent on our improvements to our existing conventional rail network?
The answer is I don't know. I'd like to think that £48 billion on improving and upgrading our existing networks a very good down payment, though.
Ronnie Cowan.
Parliamentary Under Secretary of State for Transport assured me the full stretch of HS2 will go up to Scotland. Is that the case, and when?
As the honourable gentleman will know, we're currently struggling with stage 1, 2A and 2B, but as he knows, the overall plan was always to go further.
Patterson.
Thanks. Will the Secretary of State commit to investigating the cost of those with collateral damage, such as villages like mine in war, which will suffer grievously during the construction process? And will he also commit to looking at the value of spending £100 billion, to which this project is cantering towards, on full fibre broadband to every household?
But look, I think, again, we need to have full fibre broadband, and that's a commitment of this government to every household regardless. But returning to the, as he describes, devastation to his villagers, look, I absolutely agree. People's lives, we have to look after, we have to find a better way of doing this and look after people properly when great national projects drive through their homes.
Significant UK and Welsh Government money is going into growth deals in North Wales linked to HS2 at Crewe. What opportunities are there for the Welsh Government to formally feed into the review?
Very good.
Enormous opportunities. If not on Monday, at that time that I mentioned at the dispatch box earlier, then separately I'd be very happy to hook the honourable gentleman and any of his colleagues up with Doug Oakervie on this.
Mr. Speaker, HS2 will be the most expensive railway ever built by mankind. Would he agree that there is a very significant opportunity cost, and therefore, to get bang for our buck, we should be investing in significant regional infrastructure projects?
Well, it's very effective lobbying, but I know that my honourable friend has already made a great achievement at the railway on his own island, so he proves that we can do both things simultaneously if we need to.
rail investment in the north has to be a high-speed link between Liverpool in the west and Hull in the east. And isn't it right that any additional resources should be put into that rather than HS2?
Well, I'd extend that further. Sheffield, Hull, Newcastle and other cities in the north. We can do both these things, and we will do both these things in terms of both upgrading the national rail infrastructure, but in particular, and it was the first speech of the Prime Minister in Manchester, I think it would be a bit churlish not to recognise it, which talked about linking the northern cities.
Speaker, the problem with HS2 is that the benefits are not shared around the country. The West in particular gains nothing. Will he look at how we could put the money into electrification and indeed rebuilding the Severn Tunnel?
Look, I don't know what form this will or won't take place in, but I do know that the jobs and skill and supply chain actually affects the entire nation. There's almost not a constituency in the country that wouldn't benefit in some way. As with any big national infrastructure project, we need to make sure that the benefits of that work and supply chain are spread across the nation.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Given that the entire review will be completed in a matter of weeks, can the Minister really have confidence that it will have thoroughly considered the impact scrapping or changing phases 2A and 2B would have on Crewe and Nantwich as a significant centre of economic activity for the wider region?
Yes, I think I can reassure the honourable member that although this is reporting very quickly, within weeks, as she said, the experience on that panel adds up to years. I haven't added up, possibly hundreds of years of rail experience. So I think they will really take that into account. Again, I would invite and welcome her to speak to Douglas Oakerby to make sure 2A and 2B are fully represented in her terms.
Can the Minister give us a date when we can expect HS2 to be extended to Scotland? And if not, are the people of Scotland expected to sit and watch $100 billion being spent on this project when it literally pulls up short?
Well, I don't want to disappoint the honourable lady. I can't give her a date. I can't give her a date on the initial phases, let alone that extension. But look, I do think there's a very good nation point here, isn't there, about linking up our union, and I'm pleased to see the nationalist side so on side with that project.
The Minister mentions the extension to Scotland. However, actually, journey times between Glasgow and Manchester will increase as a result of HS2. So will the Minister ask the review to consider expediting an extension north to Glasgow from Manchester as a matter of urgency?
Well, again, I think this comes into the wider picture. 48 billion of rail investment over 5 years means that we should be able to do lots of different things at the same time, and indeed are. So I think that is part of the wider infrastructure projects of improvements on rail throughout the country.
Colleagues, thank you.